Every now and again you come across a speaker that is perfectly priced and the performance is incredible. It's just stellar. It punches so far above its price class that you can't believe it. And you want to go online, you want to tell all your friends about it, you want to text, you want to do everything. This Jamo S807 Floorstanding Speaker is absolutely not one of those kind of speakers. This thing is a hot mess, no pun intended, and I'll tell you why. I ordered this speaker about a month ago off of Amazon, and I think I paid about $280 for it. My hope was that this would be one of those speakers that punched above its weight class, that had really good solid performance, and unfortunately that was not the case. If you go by what the manufacturer's specs state, such as, well, let me show you what the box says. The first spec talks about Dolby Atmos. Now on the top of these speakers are some plugs, is what I'll call them. And what you would do is you would order the Klipsch, or I guess I should say Jamo, speakers and plug them into the top, and that would provide you power through the terminals on the back. You can see two sets of terminals. The bottom one is for this speaker. This one that connects here runs to the Atmos speaker. So I'll give Jamo props for that. But getting back to the specs that they have on their box, soft dome tweeter, 1 inch, with waveguide for detailed, smooth, high frequencies. That is not the case. When I listened to these speakers and when I tested these speakers, the first thing that jumped out at me was that the high frequency range in some songs was biting and other songs was kind of harsh, and it varied all over the place. When I did my objective testing later on, I realized why, and we'll get to that shortly. Dual aluminized polyfiber woofers, 5 inch, for powerful, balanced, low frequencies. Another thing that's not really the case, when you look at this speaker, you think two 5-inch woofers ported on the front, that should get down pretty low. And some people may even think that you don't need a subwoofer for these. No, you definitely need a subwoofer. And I wouldn't even buy this speaker and put a subwoofer with it. I honestly would find a pair of cheaper bookshelf speakers, run those to like 100 hertz, and buy like $100 or $200 subwoofer and just call it a day. The reason why, when I was listening to these speakers, I noticed a lot of, not so much distortion artifacts as compression. And what compression is let's say that you've got your stereo receiver and you know that clicking the volume 3 spaces up will increase the output by 3 dB. Compression would be if you click the volume 3 spaces up, but the output only increased by 1 dB. That means something is getting lost between your receiver's power and the speaker. And in this case, I believe that it's a thermal issue with the voice coil, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Regardless, you're still losing power between your receiver or your amplifier and the speaker. What that sounds like is a very grainy, gritty kind of sound, and I know that sounds like a subjective audiophile term. What that means, though, is that as you're increasing the output, you're getting less from the speaker. It's almost like you're just hitting a brick wall. It's like, hey, all this power is going to the speaker, but it's not actually coming out of the speaker. It's getting stuck somewhere in there in between, and it just sounds bad, okay? Moving on. Matte polymer laminate with magnetic tweed grill for durable finish and modern look. So I actually do like this grill, and it is a tweed grill like they say on the box, and it is magnetic like they say on the box. Snap it on. There you go. This particular colorway, the reason I bought this one is because that's what they had available on Amazon for some reason at the time, at least. The other color options, which were white or a wooden color like this that matches this tweeter's waveguide, they were about twice the price, and I'm not sure why. Moving on, let's see. Exclusive front firing port designed for great bass from compact cabinet. I'm not sure what's exclusive about a front firing port. I've seen plenty of other speakers with front firing ports, so maybe exclusive is relative to something else. I don't know. That seems kind of odd, doesn't it? And it is actually compact. Again, it's 5-inch woofers on the front, so it's a skinny profile. And yeah, so I mean, looking at it, you think, all right. But sound quality wise, these are not good speakers. So to explain what I do when I test a speaker, I test objectively, which is to say I obtain data from it. And various means. And I also test, excuse me, I also test subjectively, which means that I listen to them. Because a lot of people, A, will say measurements don't matter, or they'll say, well, your opinion of something is different than mine. And okay, so the first one, measurements absolutely do matter, but they've got to be the right measurements under the right context. And the second one, opinions do vary. That's absolutely true. What my goal here is to do, I will take a speaker, I will listen to it before I acquire any data on it at all. I'll do my best to avoid any data that's available elsewhere. I will listen to them, I will take subjective notes, and then I will measure them objectively, and I will compare my subjective notes to the objective data. The reason I do that is because A, I want to see how well my own hearing correlates with the data I'm measuring. And a lot of times what I'll find is, or in the past what I found is, if the data doesn't correlate with what I'm hearing, it's usually because I'm not looking in the right place as far as the data itself goes, or something was awry with the test method itself. So doing that is a good way to hold me accountable to my own subjective and objective data. The other reason why is because I want to help people understand that when I tell you that a speaker sounds bright or a mid-range sounds dull or any of those kind of audiophile type terms, I want to be able to correlate that to a measurement. And ideally what we'll get to is you can go to my website, you can look at my data, you may not need me to tell you what that data means. You can say this mid-range response is doing this, it probably sounds like X. This tweeter response is doing this, it probably sounds like Y. My process for all of this starts off with me getting the speaker. I'll set it up either in my room or in my garage or somewhere, and I'll play pink noise on it at a moderate to heavy volume for about a day or two to help break it in. Not necessarily that I believe speakers need to be broken in, but because other people hold steadfast to that belief, and I don't want to get into an argument that because I didn't break it in, my results are invalid. So I do go ahead and provide them a good break-in period. And like I say, it's about 2 solid days, and it may be more or less than that. If the manufacturer were to say, you know, you need 300 hours, then I'll do that. So far, none of the speakers that I've tested have required anything more than about 2 days of worth of what I feel is necessary. Then I will bring the speaker indoors. I will set it up in my listening room, and I will use this laser distance measurement and this laser level. I will align the speaker to my ear at the proper height, proper distance that I need it to be. And then from there, I will conduct my subjective interpretation of what this thing sounds like. I have a select list of songs. I listen to all sorts of varied music. I listen to a lot of 80s, 70s rock, 90s pop. I mean, just a little bit of everything. And I list all of the information for that on my website. So if you're curious about what I listen to, you can go there and you can bash me because I don't listen to classical or Beethoven. That's not my style. It's more important to listen to music that you are very familiar with than it is to listen to music that sounds impressive to talk to your friends about, because honestly none of my friends give a flying rip about Beethoven's Fifth. Don't get mad at me, I'm just telling you the truth. So I listen to music that I'm quite familiar with, and from that I may be able to go in and kind of get a feel for how the speaker's responding. Not necessarily to say that this cello doesn't sound like a cello should, but more or less to say that this mid-range sounds subdued compared to the tweeter, or this bass sounds maybe a bit bloated because there's a resonant chamber or something like that. Those kind of characteristics help me to identify the problem areas, and when I look at the objective data later, then I can say, that's probably why, or yeah, that definitely is what I heard. It's also important to note that the listening axis be what the manufacturer says it should be. And in this case, the manufacturer didn't tell me, hey, you've got to listen to it between the woofer and the tweeter, or you've got to listen to it at the tweeter. So by default, I listen to it at the tweeter level. And from there, I set the speaker up looking directly on axis, which means that it was aimed, pointed toward me at about 30 degrees. It's closer to like 28, but 30 degrees is close enough for what we're talking about in a stereo triangle setup. These are some of the notes that I wrote down. I said Jamo S807 at the tweeter axis, which again is with my ears at the level of the tweeter. I played Rage Against Machine's Know Your Enemy, and I said nice kick, but anemic at louder volumes, compressed or high Q roll off. Well, the data turns out to show that it is both of those things. I played Joan Jett's Heartbreaker, and I said biting at mid-highs 1 to 2 kilohertz with a question mark. Let's see, I said punchy bass, but not full at around 120 hertz. I heard that, and the data also kind of backs that up, and I'll get to that. Let's see, Everybody Wants to Rule the World by Tears for Fears, my favorite song I think of all time. I said nice upper mid bass riding the synth, so it had like a doo-doo, doo-doo, doo-doo. Does that make sense? All right. Something weird in the mid bass is exactly what I wrote. I said around 60 to 100 hertz. And I was wondering how the woofers are crossed internally. I don't know, maybe there was something going on there, but figuring that out was going to take a lot more work than I was willing to do. I noted that Lauryn Hill has a gritty talking voice from 350 to 500 hertz. Let's see, any other things? Stage width seemed pretty nice and even. I also noted that highs are, quote, hot, 3 to 5 dB, question mark. And then I said guitar, ouch. So awesome. One thing that's really asked a lot is how loud can I push this speaker? So you're thinking, hey, I've got two 5-inch woofers and a ported enclosure. I can probably bang on this pretty hard, right? Well, one of the songs that I listen to is Lauryn Hill's, oh goodness, my mind just went blank. Doo-wop, that thing. The opening bass on that song, it will destroy mid-woofers. I mean, it'll make them sound horrible if they're not built right, if you don't have a long throw, long excursion, long linear excursion woofer. And it can also make them sound really compressed if the speakers aren't up to the task. And in this case, this Jamo S807 was not up to the task for that track. I pushed it to about 95 dB at my listening distance, which is about 11 feet. Let's see. Oh, I also tried turning it about 30 degrees off axis, which is to say that no longer was it pointed directly at me, at my ear, but tilted out a little bit. So if this is the speaker and this is a back wall, let's say that you are the listener. Now the speaker's aiming on axis. Now if I rotate it 30 degrees, it's facing more straight and flush against a wall. So by doing that, the treble dropped down a little bit in level because the high frequency tends to drop in level as it's turned away from you, and that makes sense. I wanted to note that in These Dreams by Heart, that the side voices, the voices that panned, split the stage height, and that's really weird. I normally don't hear that in a good speaker. That, to me, that shows a very poor crossover, and in this case, this thing has a very poor crossover. Now, when I say split height, what I mean is part of the vocal would sound like it's emanating from, maybe one of these woofers down here, while another part of the vocal would sound like it's emanating up here, instead of sounding like it's one point source, one cohesive location that's making that sound. Now that I've been over my subjective notes, let's look at the data, and we'll walk through some of what I found and maybe see if we can correlate what I heard with what the data shows. Here I am at my website, which is erinsaudiocorner.com, and I have the listing for the S807 Floorstanding Speaker by Jamo. I'm going to click that link. And then most of this in the intro is some reasons why I bought the speaker, what I expected, and then I have some product specs and photos. If you were to click this down arrow, you could see my notes on subjective analysis versus objective data and how I like to try to correlate the two. But I'm going to scroll down until I get to where the data begins. And we're going to start it in this window. I'm blowing it up so it will show up better in the video. The first graphic is the impedance sweep taken at two different drive voltages. One is 0.1 and the other is 2.83. 0.1 is standard or typical in the audio industry. The reason why is because it's not driving a speaker into nonlinearity. It's a very low voltage. You're not expecting any distortion from this low voltage. The reason I choose to overlay 2.83 volt impedance is because typical sensitivity measurements, frequency response measurements are done based on 2.83 volts. I want to see how that looks overlaid with the impedance. One thing you can note here is I've labeled the minimum load at 7.1 ohm, and that's down here. It's actually below 5 hertz. For the most part, the speaker is 8 ohm or above. No problem for a standard AVR or amplifier to drive this load. This is the impedance at 2.83 volts overlaid against the frequency response on axis at 2.83 volts. This one is just if you want to try to correlate some things. For example, there's some wiggles around here in the 200 hertz region, and there's also a little bump around the 400 hertz region. Typically, those are signs of resonance either in the enclosure or the speaker basket or something along those lines. Without disassembling the speaker in the enclosure and doing further testing, you won't know for sure, but that definitely gives you a pointer, and you can almost always see it in the frequency response as long as the resolution of the measurement data is high enough in order to see it. What I mean by that is if you have a poor resolution frequency response that only has a data point at 200 hertz and then maybe 600 hertz, then obviously I'm connecting a line between two data points. I'm not going to see all the other data points in here. That's one drawback to doing the typical far field measurement that people do in their garages or their homes. It's also one benefit of me using the Clipple system because I can gather response resolution as low as or as high as 20 hertz steps, whereas most people's is 200 hertz at best. So I'm able to show these kind of resonance and details. Moving on, this is an important graphic to me. This shows the frequency response measured on axis, but then also has some important things such as the calculated mean SPL, which is taken from 300 hertz to 3000 hertz. And again, that's at 0 degrees axis. The mean SPL for this Jamo speaker is about 84.2 dB. Now, the gray area highlights the plus or minus 1.5 dB window from the mean. The blue area is the plus or minus 3 dB window from the mean. Plus or minus 3 dB for a speaker is kind of the norm. If it's within that, it's okay. If you're within plus or minus 1.5 dB through most of its range, that's really quite good. You obviously have exceptions when the frequency response starts to roll off. You know, you're not really paying attention to it that much below that point. But in this case, the Jamo speaker, you can see that it actually has a very, very poor response linearity, where it's F3, which is its negative 3 dB point, compared to, again, the mean SPL that I've calculated at 84.2 dB. It is down 3 dB at about 53 hertz. Then it increases from, goodness, I don't know, what is that, a swing of about 5 dB, maybe 6, to the peak at 80 hertz where it gets that punchy sound that some people might like. And I think actually most people like that until they kind of know better and realize you don't have anything else carrying that punchy sound. So you don't have any harmonics from the 80 hertz to the 160. You're about 3 dB delta between these 2 points. The response dips below the plus or minus 3 dB axis from about 400 to about 600 or so hertz. And then it rises again through the crossover region, which is in here, poor directivity mismatch, and increases outside the plus or minus 3 dB window to about plus 5 or plus 6 dB in the treble compared to the mid-range. That's hot. I think this is probably where they're getting away with the quote-unquote detailed response aspect. To some people, especially those who are newer to trying to learn about audiophile stereos and good sound, that may sound detailed. It may sound like, oh great, that's a wonderful sound, but it's not. After a couple minutes of that, your ears will start to hurt. You'll get tired of it, and it's just not a well-balanced response. So overall, I would give this a very, very poor score. It's also interesting to note that Jamo claims a plus or minus 3 dB window of 42 to 26 kilohertz. 42 hertz to 26 kilohertz. There is no way. That's nonsense is what that is. So carrying on. This is the horizontal frequency response from about 0 to 90 degrees. So basically you looking directly at the speaker to you walking around to the side of the speaker. And then this is just normalized. This takes the 0 degree response and flattens it out against each axis. So you can see how each axis behaves. Graphics like this and this are all good because they tell you how the speaker behaves on and off axis. You care about the on axis sound because that's the first thing you hear. That's called the direct sound. but you also care about what is being spread out throughout the room because you listen in a room. So let's go down. These are all spectrograms, and really I encourage you to come back to the website and read a little bit about them if you want to. I don't want to get bogged down in trying to explain these at this very moment. This is another interpretation of how I do spectrograms. I roll them out into a pattern. So this would be the radiation of the speaker if it were looking downward, and this section back here would be the back, and then plus or minus 90 degrees side to side. So what I'm saying here is that I am firing frontward at 0 degrees. It's a bit hotter. It's around 90 dB, 87 dB in this region based on the scale over here. And that is about plus or minus 20 degrees and about 13 kilohertz to about 5 kilohertz. So there's a peak around here somewhere, which should also correlate to the on-axis frequency response linearity graphic that you saw above. And we'll kind of keep going. So Spinorama Data, what this essentially is trying to tell you is this is how you're going to hear the speaker in a room. These calculations are based on a multitude of various type rooms, and from that they've derived some equations, and they can actually do a really good job of predicting how the speaker is going to respond in your room. So starting off, the black line is the on-axis response. This is what you mostly hear. The green line is the listening window, which is plus or minus 30 degrees to each side, plus or minus 10 degrees vertically. The early reflections curve is a culmination of all sorts of response curves. So horizontally, it's essentially everything that fires forward and backwards, and a limited window of vertical reflections as well. The predicted in-room response, which is the cyan color, is actually a good predictor of what the response will be like in your room, and I'll get to this shortly. And then sound power is the red line, and that indicates what the response would be like for the speaker in all axes, vertically and horizontally, basically 360 degrees around it horizontally and vertically. And then the directivity plots are a good way to get a feel for how the speaker's radiation pattern is being placed. So an omnidirectional speaker would radiate sound in all directions, all axes, vertically and horizontally, basically a big, huge sphere of sound. And if you were to have that, you would have a directivity index value of 0 because there would be no change in how the speaker radiates forward or backwards, up or down. What you really want to look for in graphics like this are changes to the pattern in directivity. Especially, I'll look at the early reflections because that's what I care about. That's indicative more of the room sound itself. So if we're following along, we see a change here. This correlates well with the response issues that we saw earlier, the resonances or the resonance. And then you can see this value increasing. Now this value is increasing because the 5-inch woofers are beginning to radiate more forward than they do around. That's due a couple reasons here. One is beaming. Beaming is essentially just another way of saying that as a speaker increases in frequency relative to its size, it no longer radiates in all directions, it radiates more forward. And there are also other issues too there with the radiation pattern. Lobing is the key word there, but I won't get into that here. The other issue with this particular speaker is that there are two 5-inch woofers, and that's also going to contribute to the pattern here, causing it to go up. Now that's more so vertically, but I believe that that's also an influencer here. Not a huge influencer though. So you see the directivity is increasing up again because the woofer is likely beaming, and then it dips back down. Well, this tells you that this is probably the area where the tweeter is crossed over. Why do I say that? Okay, tweeters beam like any other speaker, but they don't beam until higher frequencies. There's actually a formula for this. If you come to my website, I believe I have it listed here. If I don't, feel free to ask me in the comments. I'll list it for you. So the tweeter would come into play at about 3000 hertz. It's omnidirectional. It's radiating in all axes. And then around, based on its size, around 7K or so, it starts to become directional as its radiation pattern trends from omnidirectional to forward facing. And that's okay that it's trending forward. That's not a big deal. The real issue here are these resonances and then this directivity mismatch. The directivity mismatch is an issue because now what you're hearing firing forward from the on-axis response up here isn't radiating the same way throughout the room. In some spots of the room, you may have less energy at 2 kilohertz because the speaker is becoming more directive, and you may have more energy at 3 to 6 kilohertz because the tweeter is now playing, it's more omnidirectional. You've got a pattern mismatch between the woofers beginning to beam and the tweeter playing omnidirectionally. Early reflection curves break out, and this just tells you how different parts of the room are predicted to interact with the frequency response, and you can kind of get an idea of what you could do. Could you add treatment to the side walls? Could you add carpet to the floor? Could you add treatment to the ceiling, etc.? This is the predicted response curve that I gave previously. I've just given it again, and I've also overlaid a negative 1 dB per octave target curve. Where did I get the target curve? Well, research shows that the majority of people prefer a target curve that is smooth, sloping, no immediate jumps or anything like that. So that's a normal desired target curve, and it actually works out pretty well. What this does is it shows you that the predicted in-room response is going to vary from that target curve. So let's say you're riding along, you're about maybe 2 dB, 3 dB off until about 1.6K. And then when you get to 2K, you're kind of at a break-even point, but then from there, it just shoots up. So you're about 7 dB in your high frequencies from that predicted target curve in your room. And this target curve actually does work out really well. This is my distortion and compression testing. And all this is telling you is that there was distortion at higher output volumes, and the compression was high at higher output volumes as well. This is the same thing I spoke about earlier. These are some extra measurements. This is the response matching between the two different speakers, the pair that I received. You're within about 1 dB, well, about half a dB for the most part between the two speakers, which is, I don't know, I think that's okay. It's not great, but it's a budget speaker, so you don't expect a high tolerance. The concern here is that when you drop off on the high end, I'm not really sure what's going on there. So that's different, and you definitely don't want more than a dB difference. This is the grill on versus off. What this is really showing you is that you want the grill off. There's a lot of combing artifacts here. I did some accelerometer testing on the cabinet. No real issues to speak of. You can see I've done some near field responses, which is when you just take the speaker, or you take the microphone, put it up next to the speaker or the port, and measure the response. Some things you can get out of this, for instance, the port near field response shows a resonance here that's also showing up in the frequency response. There are some resonances higher in frequency that look like they're appearing in the frequency response as well. There's also some woofer, the yellow and the blue lines represent the woofers measured near field, breakup that also shows up in the frequency response. Same thing here with more woofer breakup showing up in the frequency response in the black line. And then the tweeter's near field response shows some issues as well. A lot of resonances in this speaker. Step response, if you care about timing, that's for you. This goes through my subjective listening. Again, I encourage you to go through and read all of this if you'd like. We're trying to hit the highlights. So again, this is very similar to what we just spoke about. This is the predicted in-room response in black, target curve in red. So those two factors are the same, but they're overlaid with the in-room response measurements that I took using REW and pink noise. And you can see that above about 1K, all of my in-room actual measured responses almost identical to the predicted in-room curve. However, below this, you start getting things like room modes and things like that. And then you also have to keep in mind that my speakers that I'm testing in my room are also just forward of my actual home theater speakers. So there's going to be some boundary effects there. It's not a big deal. The point being that the predicted in-room response curve does an extremely good job of telling me what I'm going to get when I put the speaker in my room. And that's amazing. If you could take this one piece of data and say, okay, if this is indicative of most rooms, unless you have a very unusual room, you could say, hey, this speaker is probably going to sound this certain way based on the predicted in-room response curve in black. And that's very, very neat. And that does it for the objective analysis. My final verdict and recommendation is to not buy the Jamo S807. This speaker performs very badly. It has a terribly unbalanced frequency response starting from the bass to the treble, where it's almost 5 to 6 dB hotter than the mid-range. It compresses badly at higher output volumes, and the volumes that I would expect this speaker to be able to handle well, it doesn't handle. You're still going to need a subwoofer for it if you want to get below about 80 hertz, which in my opinion defeats the entire purpose of even having a floor standing speaker. I think you're better served to spend your money on a smaller bookshelf speaker and maybe a 10-inch subwoofer, dedicated subwoofer for something like that. I know that some people like the allure of having, you know, a speaker all together and you don't have to have a separate subwoofer, but I imagine that if you're going with something like this, then you're probably also going to try to get a subwoofer still anyway for a maybe a budget home theater setup or a budget home stereo audiophile type quality on a budget. This speaker is not that. This speaker is budget, but it is anything but audiophile quality. Do yourself a favor. Do not buy the Jamo S807. Please. That's going to do it for this review. I hope you guys got something out of it, and I hope that you don't waste your money on this speaker. Thanks.